In the shadows of a rapidly unfolding World War II, the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union from November 1939 to March 1940 stands as a stark reminder of the complexities and unforeseen consequences of military conflicts. This short but intense conflict not only tested the resilience of Finland against the might of the Soviet Union but also exposed the vulnerabilities of the Red Army, influencing the strategic calculations of Nazi Germany and highlighting the disarray within the Allies. As we delve into this historical event, we uncover a tale of political maneuverings, military strategies, and the human cost of war. From the harsh Finnish winter battlegrounds to the diplomatic corridors of Europe, the Winter War reshaped the geopolitical landscape, setting the stage for the tumultuous years that followed. Join us as we explore the pivotal moments, key figures, and lasting impacts of this often overlooked conflict. This is the Animated General. Let's dive in. The Winter War stands as a remarkable chapter in the annals of 20th century warfare, showcasing the resilience of Finland in the face of overwhelming odds. Initiated by the Soviet Union's invasion on November 30, 1939, this conflict unfolded against the backdrop of the early stages of World War II. Despite the Soviet military's superiority in tanks, aircraft, and manpower, Finland mounted a formidable defense that inflicted significant losses on the invaders and hindered their progress. The League of Nations' response to the Soviet aggression was swift and unequivocal, condemning the invasion as illegal and leading to the Soviet Union's expulsion from the League. This international reaction underscored the broader geopolitical implications of the conflict, highlighting the complexities of international law and the global balance of power during a turbulent period. The Moscow Peace Treaty, signed on March 13, 1940, brought an end to hostilities, but the Winter War left a lasting legacy. It demonstrated the potential of smaller nations to defend themselves against more powerful adversaries, and it had a profound impact on military strategies and international relations in the subsequent years of World War II and beyond. The courage and tenacity of the Finnish people during the Winter War have been remembered as a symbol of national resilience and determination. The dynamics and strategic maneuvers of the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland reveal a complex interplay of military ambition, political strategy, and the harsh realities of warfare in extreme conditions. The Soviets' initial demands, centered on the cession of significant Finnish border territories in exchange for land elsewhere, were rooted in security concerns, with a particular emphasis on safeguarding Leningrad, situated merely 32 kilometers, 20 miles, from the Finnish border. Finland's refusal to acquiesce to these demands led to the Soviet invasion, marking the beginning of a conflict that would test the mettle of both nations. The debate among historians and sources regarding the Soviet Union's ultimate objectives in Finland underscores the multifaceted nature of the conflict. While many point to the establishment of a puppet Finnish communist government and the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as evidence of the Soviet Union's intent to annex Finland entirely, others argue against the notion of a planned full-scale conquest. This dispute highlights the complexities of interpreting historical intentions and outcomes. Despite the overwhelming odds, Finland demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical ingenuity, repelling Soviet assaults for over 2 months under the grueling conditions of extreme cold, with temperatures dropping as low as -43 degrees Celsius, -45 degrees Fahrenheit. The Finnish defense focused on strategic locations such as Taipale along the Karelian Isthmus, Kalaa in Ladoga Karelia, and Raete Road in Kainuu, with additional confrontations in Salla and Petsamo in Lapland. These battles inflicted significant losses on the Soviet forces and showcased the Finnish army's capability to leverage its knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions to its advantage. The initial Soviet setbacks led to a reassessment of their strategic objectives, culminating in the dissolution of the puppet Finnish communist government and an openness to peace negotiations. The subsequent reorganization of the Soviet military and the adoption of new tactics marked a turning point in the conflict. The renewed offensive in February 1940 eventually overwhelmed Finnish defenses on the Karelian Isthmus, pushing the Finnish army to the brink and paving the way for peace negotiations. Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim's advocacy for a peace deal, while Finland still possessed bargaining power, was pivotal in bringing the Winter War to a close. The Winter War remains a testament to Finland's strategic defense and the complexities inherent in international conflict resolution, reflecting both the physical and diplomatic challenges of warfare. The conclusion of the Winter War through the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940 marked a significant juncture in early 20th century European history. Finland's cession of 9% of its territory to the Soviet Union was a testament to the harsh realities of international diplomacy and conflict resolution, underscoring the sacrifices nations are sometimes compelled to make in the pursuit of peace. While the treaty secured Soviet territorial gains exceeding their pre-war demands, including substantial areas along Lake Ladoga and further north, it came at a considerable cost. The Soviet Union's heavy losses during the conflict not only diminished its international standing but also exposed vulnerabilities within the Red Army. This outcome had profound implications for global perceptions of Soviet military might, influencing both strategic calculations and diplomatic relations. The perceived poor performance of the Red Army during the Winter War served as a catalyst for Nazi Germany's strategic planning. Adolf Hitler, observing the Soviet military's difficulties, saw an opportunity, concluding that the Soviet Union was vulnerable to attack. This assessment contributed to his decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941. Moreover, the Winter War and its aftermath had a significant impact on Finland. Despite the territorial losses, Finland managed to retain its sovereignty and emerged from the conflict with an enhanced international reputation. The resilience and determination displayed by the Finnish people and military were recognized globally, contributing to a sense of national pride and solidarity. The Winter War also played a role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe. The cessation of hostilities was but a brief interlude before the eruption of further conflict, as evidenced by the onset of the continuation war between Finland and the Soviet Union in the wake of Operation Barbarossa. This subsequent conflict further complicated the intricate web of military and diplomatic engagements in the region, reflecting the enduring impact of the Winter War on the course of World War II and the broader history of the 20th century. The historical trajectory of Finland from the eastern part of the Kingdom of Sweden to an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire is a compelling narrative of geopolitical shifts and the quest for national sovereignty. The Finnish War, fought from February 21, 1808, to September 17, 1809, between the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Sweden, was pivotal in altering the balance of power in the region. The Russian Empire, under the pretext of safeguarding its capital, St. Petersburg, initiated this conflict with strategic ambitions that extended beyond mere defensive posturing. The culmination of the war saw Russia emerge victorious, leading to the annexation of Finland and its establishment as an autonomous buffer state. This period, known as the era of the Grand Duchy of Finland, was characterized by a significant degree of autonomy for Finland within the Russian Empire. This autonomy allowed for the flourishing of Finnish culture, language, and administrative systems, setting the stage for the emergence of a distinct Finnish identity. However, the turn of the 19th century brought with it shifts in Russian imperial policy, notably the attempts at Russification aimed at assimilating Finland more directly into the Russian Empire. This initiative was part of a broader strategy to centralize authority and unify the diverse entities of the empire under a single, Russian identity. These attempts at Russification, which included efforts to impose the Russian language and administrative systems, met with significant resistance in Finland, exacerbating tensions between Finland and the Russian central government. The discontent in Finland was further fueled by Russia's internal turmoil, including the revolutionary movements that challenged the Tsarist regime. The Russian government's focus on quelling domestic unrest inadvertently provided a respite from the Russification efforts, but the damage to Russo-Finnish relations was already done. This period of strained relations and the evident failure of the Russification policies contributed to the growth of self-determination movements within Finland. The increasing support for Finnish self-determination can be seen as a direct consequence of both the legacy of autonomy under the Grand Duchy and the nationalist response to Russian assimilation attempts. These developments set the stage for Finland's eventual path toward independence, highlighting the complex interplay between imperial ambitions, national identity, and the struggle for sovereignty that has shaped Finland's history. The tumultuous period of World War I and the subsequent Russian Revolution of 1917 set the stage for significant geopolitical shifts, particularly for the nations under the Russian Empire's dominion, including Finland. The collapse of the Tsarist regime and the rise of the Bolshevik government marked a pivotal moment in history, radically altering the fabric of Eastern European and Nordic geopolitics. The Bolsheviks' November 1917 declaration acknowledging the right of national minorities to self-determination, including the right to secede and form independent states, opened a critical window of opportunity for Finland. This policy, revolutionary in its implications, was part of the broader Bolshevik agenda to distinguish their regime from the imperialist policies of the Tsarist government and to gain support among the various nationalities within the former Russian Empire. Seizing this moment, the Senate of Finland, on December 6, 1917, made a bold move to declare Finland's independence, thereby initiating a new chapter in Finnish history. This declaration was not just a political formality, it was a profound assertion of Finnish national identity and sovereignty, born out of centuries of external rule. Remarkably, the new Soviet Russia recognized the Finnish government just 3 weeks after the declaration, a rapid acknowledgement that underscored the Bolsheviks' commitment to their policy on national self-determination. However, Finland's path to full sovereignty was far from straightforward. The nascent Finnish state was immediately plunged into a brutal civil war that lasted from January to May 1918. This conflict, often seen as part of the broader struggles between socialist and conservative forces that swept through Europe in the aftermath of World War I, pitted the socialist Reds, who had support from the Bolsheviks, against the conservative Whites. The Whites' forces were bolstered by support from the Imperial German Army, pro-German Jaegers, elite Finnish volunteers trained in Germany, and some Swedish troops. This external support was instrumental in their ultimate victory over the Reds. The Finnish Civil War's conclusion and the expulsion of Bolshevik troops solidified Finland's sovereignty, setting the foundation for the nation's development as an independent state. This period of conflict, though marked by deep divisions and significant loss, was a crucible through which the modern Finnish state was forged. Finland's emergence as a fully sovereign nation in the aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution reflects the complex interplay of internal political dynamics and external geopolitical pressures that characterized the early 20th century. Finland's entry into the League of Nations in 1920 marked a significant milestone in the young nation's efforts to secure its position on the international stage and ensure its security and sovereignty in the aftermath of its independence and the subsequent Civil War. Joining the League represented not only a step towards integrating Finland into the international community but also a move to seek formal guarantees that could safeguard against potential threats, particularly from its powerful neighbor, the Soviet Union. However, Finland's strategic orientation in the realm of security and defense was primarily regional, with a keen focus on fostering cooperation with the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden. This focus was driven by cultural affinities, geographical proximity, and shared interests in maintaining stability and security in the Nordic region. The cooperation aimed at the exchange of information and defense planning, including the joint defense of strategically significant areas such as Åland, an archipelago at the entrance to the Gulf of Bothnia. The Åland Islands, due to their geographical location, held considerable military and symbolic importance for both Finland and Sweden. Despite these collaborative efforts, Sweden maintained a cautious approach towards committing itself to Finnish foreign policy objectives fully. This careful stance can be attributed to Sweden's long-standing policy of neutrality, which it sought to preserve amidst the complex and often volatile geopolitical landscape of post-World War I Europe. Sweden's reluctance to enter into binding military commitments did not, however, diminish the importance of Finnish-Swedish cooperation in other areas, including economic and cultural exchanges. In addition to its Nordic focus, Finland's military policy also encompassed clandestine defense cooperation with Estonia. This bilateral relationship was grounded in shared concerns over regional security and the mutual recognition of the Soviet Union as a potential threat to both nations' independence. The cooperation with Estonia, though less highlighted, was an integral component of Finland's broader strategy to build a network of regional alliances and partnerships to bolster its security and defense capabilities. Finland's engagement with the League of Nations and its efforts to foster regional cooperation in Scandinavia and the Baltic region underscore the nation's proactive approach to navigating the complex interwar period. Through diplomacy, regional partnerships, and selective cooperation, Finland sought to consolidate its sovereignty, protect its independence, and contribute to the stability and security of the Nordic and Baltic regions. The aftermath of the Finnish Civil War, which had pitted the conservative Whites against the socialist Reds, left deep scars on Finnish society and politics. This period, extending to the early 1930s, was characterized by significant political instability driven by the enduring rivalry between conservatives and socialists. The fissures in Finnish society were not merely ideological but were deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the nation, reflecting the broader tumultuous post-World War I landscape across Europe. The Communist Party of Finland, which had ties to the Soviet Union and represented the radical left-wing elements within Finnish politics, became a focal point of contention. In 1931, amidst growing fears of a communist influence and the potential for a Soviet-backed insurrection, the Finnish government took the drastic step of outlawing the Communist Party. This move was indicative of the broader anti-communist sentiment that had taken hold in various parts of Europe and the world during this era. The anti-communist fervor found a more militant expression in the form of the Lapua movement. Founded in the town of Lapua in 1929, this nationalist and right-wing group orchestrated a campaign of violence against communists and their sympathizers, advocating for a more authoritarian and nationalist governance model to counter the perceived communist threat. The movement's activities culminated in a failed coup attempt in 1932, known as the Montala Rebellion, which sought to overthrow the Finnish government. The coup's failure led to the decline of the Lapua movement, but its spirit lived on in the Patriotic People's Movement, IKL, its successor organization. Despite the IKL's ambition to reshape Finnish politics, it never managed to secure a significant presence in the Finnish parliament, highlighting the limits of extremist movements in garnering broad-based support. By the late 1930s, Finland witnessed a notable shift in its political and economic landscape. The Finnish economy, driven by an export-oriented approach, began to experience growth, contributing to a sense of stability and prosperity that had eluded the nation in the preceding years. This economic upturn, coupled with the diminishing influence of extreme political movements, suggested a move towards greater political and social stability. The waning of extremist factions, both on the right and left, paved the way for more moderate and democratic political processes, setting the stage for Finland's resilient response to the challenges that lay ahead, including the looming threat of World War II. The period from the Finnish Civil War to the prelude of World War II illustrates the complexities of Finland's journey towards stability and democracy. It underscores how economic development, combined with a rejection of extremist politics, can play a crucial role in healing a divided society and strengthening a nation's democratic foundations. The interwar period, particularly in the late 1930s, was characterized by a significant shift in Soviet foreign policy under Joseph Stalin, particularly regarding Finland. Stalin's dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union's inability to influence the Finnish Revolution and concerns over the pro-Finland movement in Karelia highlighted the broader strategic considerations that were beginning to shape Soviet actions towards Finland. Stalin's apprehension that Finland could serve as a staging ground for an invasion of the Soviet Union or as a base to restrict Soviet fleet movements in the Baltic was not just a matter of military strategy, it was deeply rooted in the trauma of the Russian Civil War and the loss of Tsarist territories. This fear was exacerbated by the proximity of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, to the Finnish border, a mere 32 kilometers away, making the city vulnerable to potential military actions from Finland. Soviet propaganda efforts to depict Finnish leadership as a fascist clique were aimed at delegitimizing Finland's government and justifying potential Soviet actions against Finland. This campaign targeted prominent Finnish figures like Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, a key military leader and a symbol of Finnish independence, and Väinö Tanner, leader of the Finnish Social Democratic Party, thereby seeking to sow discord and undermine Finland's image both domestically and internationally. The Great Purge of 1938, a brutal campaign of political repression, allowed Stalin to consolidate absolute power and marked a turning point in Soviet foreign policy. This period saw a more aggressive stance towards Finland, with the Soviet Union aiming to reconquer territories lost during the turmoil of the October Revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War. This ambition reflected a broader strategy to secure the Soviet Union's western borders against external threats, particularly the rising power of Nazi Germany. The Soviet leadership's desire to secure extended borders as a means of territorial security was rooted in historical experiences of vulnerability and invasion. The emphasis on securing Leningrad was particularly poignant, given the city's symbolic and strategic importance. This complex mix of historical grievances, security concerns, and geopolitical ambitions set the stage for the tensions that culminated in the Winter War, illustrating how past conflicts and strategic considerations can influence the course of international relations. In the late 1930s, as Europe teetered on the brink of another major conflict, the Soviet Union sought to secure its western borders against potential threats. The approach to Finland was part of this broader strategy, aiming to mitigate the perceived risk posed by the proximity of the Finnish border to Leningrad, a key Soviet city. The NKVD agent Boris Yartsev's outreach to Finnish officials in April 1938 reflects the complexities of the geopolitical situation at the time. The Soviet Union, wary of the intentions of Nazi Germany and anticipating the possibility of conflict, proposed a proactive military posture that included securing strategic territories beyond its borders. Yartsev's discussions with Finnish Foreign Minister Rudolf Hallstein and Prime Minister Amo Kajander underscored the Soviet Union's interest in preemptively addressing security vulnerabilities. The suggestion that Finland's Seed or Lease Islands in the Gulf of Finland was aimed at strengthening the Soviet Union's defensive perimeter around Leningrad. However, Finland's steadfast commitment to neutrality and its resolve to resist any armed incursion led to a refusal of the Soviet proposals. This response was indicative of Finland's determination to maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity, even in the face of significant pressure from a powerful neighbor. The negotiations that unfolded throughout 1938 without yielding any tangible results further illustrated the deep-seated mistrust between Finland and the Soviet Union. Finland's cool reception of Soviet entreaties was influenced by the widespread knowledge of the violent collectivization efforts and purges carried out under Stalin's regime. These actions had led to a negative perception of the Soviet Union in Finland, compounded by the execution of most of the Finnish communist elite during the Great Purge, which further strained relations. At the same time, Finland's efforts to engage in military cooperation with Sweden, particularly regarding the joint defense of Åland, highlighted its proactive approach to ensuring national security through regional alliances. The Åland Islands, situated at a strategic point in the Baltic Sea, were of considerable military and political significance to both Finland and Sweden. The period leading up to World War II was marked by a series of diplomatic maneuvers, covert operations, and military preparations as countries across Europe sought to safeguard their interests amid the growing threat of conflict. The interactions between Finland and the Soviet Union during this time were reflective of the broader tensions and uncertainties that characterized the international system, revealing the challenges of diplomacy and security in an increasingly volatile world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939 between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, marked a pivotal moment in the lead-up to World War II. On the surface, it was presented as a non-aggression treaty, symbolizing a temporary truce between two ideologically opposed regimes. However, the inclusion of a secret protocol that delineated spheres of interest in Eastern Europe underscored the realpolitik considerations driving both powers. According to this clandestine agreement, Finland, along with the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. The signing of the pact had immediate and far-reaching consequences. On September 1, 1939, Germany launched its invasion of Poland, initiating the European phase of World War II. The United Kingdom and France responded by declaring war on Germany, marking the official start of hostilities. The Soviet Union, leveraging the provisions of the secret protocol, invaded eastern Poland on September 17, further dismembering the Polish state in coordination with Nazi Germany. The fate of the Baltic states soon became a cautionary tale for Finland. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were coerced into accepting treaties that allowed the Soviet Union to establish military bases on their territories, effectively compromising their sovereignty. These ultimatums, accepted under duress in September and October 1939, underscored the Soviet Union's strategic ambitions in the region. In contrast to the Baltic states' acquiescence, Finland adopted a different approach. The Finnish government initiated a gradual mobilization under the pretext of additional refresher training, a discreet but decisive preparation for the possibility of armed conflict. This measured response reflected Finland's commitment to maintaining its sovereignty and its readiness to defend itself against potential aggression. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had been actively preparing for a possible military engagement with Finland. Intensive mobilization efforts along the Finnish border had been underway since 1938 to 1939. Indicating that the Soviet leadership was contemplating military action well before the formal outbreak of World War II. The deployment of assault troops necessary for an invasion began in October 1939, with operational plans targeting a November start date for the invasion. The starkly different responses of Finland and the Baltic states to the threats posed by the Soviet Union highlight the complex geopolitical dynamics of the period. While the Baltic states were forced into submission, Finland's preparation for resistance set the stage for the Winter War, a conflict that would test the resilience and resolve of the Finnish people. The pre-war maneuvers and diplomatic engagements underscore the intricate interplay of military strategy, international diplomacy, and national sovereignty that define the tumultuous opening chapter of World War II in Northern Europe. The invitation extended by the Soviet Union to the Finnish delegation for negotiations in Moscow on October 5, 1939, signified a critical moment in the prelude to the Winter War. The choice of Juho Kusti Paasikivi, the Finnish envoy to Sweden, to represent Finland underscored the significance Finland attached to these discussions. Paasikivi, a seasoned diplomat and politician, was well versed in the complexities of Finnish-Soviet relations, making him an apt choice for such high-stakes negotiations. The attendance of Joseph Stalin himself at the negotiations was a clear indicator of the importance the Soviet Union placed on these talks. Stalin's personal involvement signaled the Kremlin's intent to directly influence the outcome, underscoring the strategic considerations at play for the Soviet Union in securing its western borders and asserting its influence over Finland. Paasikivi's recollections of the negotiations highlighted the unexpectedly cordial atmosphere in which the Finnish delegation was received. His surprise at the friendly demeanor and pleasant manners of Stalin and the Soviet negotiators offers a fascinating glimpse into the diplomatic efforts employed by the Soviet leadership to achieve their objectives. This congenial approach was likely aimed at easing tensions and facilitating an agreement that would align with Soviet strategic interests without resorting to military confrontation. The juxtaposition of the seemingly amicable nature of the negotiations with the underlying tensions and the grave implications of the talks underscores the complex dynamics of international diplomacy. The Soviet Union's attempts to negotiate territorial concessions and security arrangements with Finland, set against the backdrop of the broader geopolitical upheavals of the time, illustrate the intricate balance between diplomacy and strategic military considerations. The negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union in October 1939 were a critical episode in the lead-up to the Winter War, reflecting the fraught path of diplomacy in the shadow of looming conflict. Despite the initial cordiality, The deep-seated issues at stake and the divergent interests of the two countries would soon lead to a confrontation that tested the resilience of Finland and marked a significant chapter in the history of European conflicts. The negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union, which commenced on October 12, 1939, were pivotal in the lead-up to the Winter War, revealing the complex interplay of territorial, strategic, and security concerns that define the relationship between the two nations. The Soviet Union, represented by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, initially proposed a mutual assistance pact. This proposition, which would have implied a closer military and political alignment between Finland and the Soviet Union, was immediately rejected by the Finnish delegation. The Finns' refusal reflected their commitment to maintaining neutrality and sovereignty, particularly in the face of demands that they perceived as compromising their national security. Molotov's subsequent shift from proposing a mutual assistance pact to an outright demand for territorial concessions caught the Finnish delegation by surprise. The new Soviet proposal involved significant alterations to the Finnish-Soviet border, particularly on the strategically vital Karelian Isthmus. The demand to move the border westward to a point merely 30 kilometers east of Viipuri, Viborg, and to dismantle all existing fortifications in the area represented a direct challenge to Finland's defensive capabilities and territorial integrity. Additionally, the Soviet demands extended to the cession of several islands in the Gulf of Finland and the Raibeiki Peninsula, Kalastajasaarento in Finnish, further encroaching on Finnish sovereignty. The stipulation that Finland leased the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years and allow the establishment of a Soviet military base there was another point of contention. In exchange for these significant concessions, the Soviet Union offered to cede Repola and Pohjanjärvi from eastern Karelia, an area twice the size of the territory demanded from Finland. However, the strategic importance of the territories demanded by the Soviets far outweighed the quantitative area offered in return. The Soviet proposal underscored the Kremlin's strategic objectives to secure its western border and enhance the defense of Leningrad. From the Finnish perspective, the demands were seen as an unacceptable infringement on their sovereignty and a direct threat to their national security. The Finnish delegation's resistance to these demands reflected a broader determination to uphold Finland's independence and territorial integrity, even in the face of immense pressure from a powerful neighbor. The negotiations of October 1939 were a critical moment in Finnish-Soviet relations, laying bare the deep-seated tensions and conflicting interests that would soon erupt into open conflict. The refusal of the Finnish delegation to accede to Soviet demands set the stage for the Winter War, a conflict that would test the resilience of the Finnish nation and leave a lasting mark on the historical narrative of both countries. The divergent views within the Finnish government regarding the Soviet offer highlighted the deep uncertainties and strategic dilemmas faced by Finland in the shadow of potential conflict with the Soviet Union. Field Marshal Gustaf Mannerheim, a seasoned military leader with a keen understanding of Finland's strategic situation, advocated for an agreement with the Soviet Union. Mannerheim's stance was rooted in a pragmatic assessment of the military realities, acknowledging the vast disparity in military capabilities between Finland and the Soviet Union. His pessimism regarding Finland's prospects in a direct military confrontation underscored the grave risks involved in rejecting the Soviet demands. On the other side of the debate, the Finnish government's hesitance to reach an agreement was fueled by a profound mistrust of Stalin and the Soviet regime. There was a prevailing fear that acquiescing to the initial Soviet demands would only embolden Stalin to make further, more onerous demands in the future, thereby endangering Finnish sovereignty. This concern about a slippery slope of concessions leading to the erosion of Finland's independence was a significant factor in the government's deliberations. Complicating matters further were the positions of Foreign Minister Elhas Urho, Prime Minister Amo Kajander, and the Finnish intelligence community, who were skeptical of the Soviet Union's intentions. Many in the Finnish leadership and intelligence circles believed that the Soviet demands and the accompanying military buildup were more bluff than genuine threat, a strategic posturing by Stalin rather than a precursor to invasion. This underestimation of Soviet intentions contributed to a reluctance to compromise, underpinned by a belief that Finland could resist Soviet pressures without resorting to territorial concessions. The internal divisions within the Finnish government reflected the broader challenges of navigating a rapidly evolving and increasingly perilous geopolitical landscape. The choice between resisting Soviet demands and risking war, or making concessions at the expense of territorial integrity and sovereignty, presented Finland with a daunting dilemma. The eventual decision to stand firm against the Soviet Union, despite the varied opinions within the Finnish leadership, set the stage for the Winter War. This conflict would not only test Finland's military resilience and national unity but also shape the country's identity and its place in the international order for decades to come. In an attempt to find a middle ground amid escalating tensions, the Finnish government made two counteroffers to the Soviet Union. These proposals were a reflection of Finland's desire to maintain its sovereignty while addressing some of the Soviet security concerns, particularly regarding Leningrad. By offering to cede the Terioki area, Finland aimed to double the distance between its border and Leningrad, thus potentially alleviating Soviet fears of an imminent threat close to the city. However, this concession was significantly less than what the Soviets had initially demanded, indicating Finland's reluctance to yield to all the Soviet pressures. Furthermore, Finland's willingness to cede the islands in the Gulf of Finland demonstrated a degree of flexibility in its approach, acknowledging the strategic importance of these territories from the Soviet perspective. However, drawing a firm line at not leasing any territory for Soviet military purposes underscored Finland's commitment to safeguarding its independence and preventing any foreign military presence on its soil. This stance reflected a broader concern about the implications of allowing Soviet military bases within Finland, which could undermine Finnish sovereignty and security. The Finnish counteroffers represented a delicate balancing act, attempting to mitigate the risk of conflict while preserving the core elements of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These proposals were a testament to Finland's efforts to navigate the complex diplomatic landscape of the time, seeking a peaceful resolution to the growing tensions with the Soviet Union. The refusal to lease territory for military purposes, in particular, highlighted Finland's resolve to maintain control over its lands and to resist external pressures that could compromise its autonomy. This decision, while aimed at protecting Finnish sovereignty, also reflected the broader geopolitical dynamics of the era, where concessions of territory for military bases could have far-reaching implications for national security and the balance of power in the region. The negotiations and counteroffers between Finland and the Soviet Union in the lead-up to the Winter War illustrate the challenges of diplomacy in the face of divergent interests and security concerns. The efforts to reach a compromise, despite the eventual failure to prevent conflict, underscore the complexities of international relations and the often difficult choices nations face in safeguarding their independence and security. During the negotiation on October 23, a notable shift occurred when Stalin decided to moderate his demands on Finland, demonstrating the fluid nature of diplomatic negotiations and the influence of strategic considerations. The concessions offered by Stalin included a reduction in the territory demanded from Karelia, a decrease in the size of the garrison to be stationed on the Hanko Peninsula from 5,000 to 4,000 men, and a shortening of the lease term for Hanko to the duration of the ongoing Second World War in Europe. These adjustments signaled a willingness on the part of the Soviet Union to negotiate terms that might be more acceptable to Finland, reflecting the complexities of the geopolitical landscape and the Soviet Union's strategic recalibrations. However, the sudden change in the Soviet stance, particularly after asserting that their initial demands were minimal and non-negotiable, took the Finnish government by surprise. This shift led to a reassessment of the negotiation dynamics, with Helsinki interpreting the concessions as an indication that further compromises from the Soviet side might be achievable. In this context, the Finnish delegation, influenced by Juho Kusti Paasikivi's pragmatic approach to seeking a compromise, proposed offering the Soviets the island of Jazaro along with the Fort of Eno as part of a potential compromise. Despite Paasikivi's efforts to broker a deal that would mitigate the risk of conflict while making manageable concessions, the Finnish government in Helsinki refused these proposals. This refusal reflected a complex mix of strategic calculations, national pride, and perhaps an overestimation of the potential for additional Soviet concessions. The Finnish government's decision can also be interpreted as a manifestation of the deep-seated mistrust towards the Soviet Union, influenced by the broader historical context and the traumatic experiences of past interactions. The negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1939 illustrate the intricate dance of diplomacy, where offers, counteroffers, and strategic concessions are weighed against national interests, security concerns, and the unpredictable currents of international politics. The hesitancy of Helsinki to accept Paasikivi's compromise proposals, despite the softening of Soviet demands, highlights the challenges nations face in balancing the desire for peace with the imperative of safeguarding sovereignty and territorial integrity. The public announcement of the Soviet demands by Vyacheslav Molotov to the Supreme Soviet on October 31 represented a pivotal moment in the negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union. By taking the negotiation details public, the Soviet Union effectively solidified its position, making any subsequent reduction of demands more difficult without incurring a significant loss of prestige. This move not only surprised the Finnish delegation but also reshaped the dynamics of the negotiation process, reinforcing the Soviet narrative that their demands were already minimized and thus non-negotiable. The public disclosure of the demands served multiple purposes from the Soviet perspective. It put additional pressure on the Finnish government by appealing to international opinion and potentially isolating Finland diplomatically. Moreover, it signaled to both domestic and international audiences the Soviet Union's firm stance on the issue, portraying the demands as a reasonable and fixed baseline for ensuring the security of Leningrad and the Soviet western border. The Finnish government's eventual rejection of the Soviet offer reflected a complex interplay of internal and external factors. Domestically, public opinion and the stance of the parliament played crucial roles in shaping the government's response. The widespread public sentiment in Finland, characterized by a strong commitment to national sovereignty and awareness of Soviet intentions, influenced the government's decision-making process. The parliamentary system in Finland, with its emphasis on democratic deliberation and consensus building, further ensured that any decision regarding the Soviet demands would need to consider the broader views of the Finnish populace and their representatives. The rejection of the Soviet offer underscored Finland's resolve to maintain its territorial integrity and independence, even in the face of immense pressure from a much larger and militarily stronger neighbor. This decision, while rooted in a desire to safeguard Finland's sovereignty, set the stage for the Winter War, highlighting the profound challenges and risks associated with standing firm against demands perceived as threats to national security and autonomy. The events leading up to the Winter War illustrate the delicate balance nations must navigate between diplomatic negotiations and the defense of sovereign principles. The Finnish government's handling of the Soviet demands, influenced by public opinion, parliamentary considerations, and strategic assessments, reflects the complexities inherent in international relations and the sometimes inevitable path toward conflict when consensus cannot be reached. The meeting on November 9, where Juho Kusti Paasikivi communicated Finland's refusal to accept even the reduced Soviet demands, marked a critical juncture in the prelude to the Winter War. The Finnish stance took the Soviet leadership by surprise, as evidenced by the reactions of Joseph Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov. This moment of astonishment, particularly Stalin's inquiry about the Fort of Eno, underscored the Soviets' expectation of at least some form of concession from the Finnish side. The refusal without offering an alternative compromise, such as Eno, highlighted the depth of Finland's commitment to maintaining its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Finnish Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner's observation of the Soviet officials' reactions provides a vivid depiction of the tension and unexpected nature of the Finnish refusal. The widening eyes of the Soviet counterparts symbolize the gap between the expectations and the reality of the negotiations, reflecting a miscalculation of Finland's willingness to make concessions. The conclusion of this meeting, without any substantive agreement, marked a turning point in the negotiations. The subsequent lack of response from the Soviet Union to Finnish communications and the absence of Soviet officials to see off the Finnish delegation on November 13 were indicative of a breakdown in diplomatic efforts. The Finnish delegation's departure under the assumption that negotiations would continue reveals the lingering hope for a diplomatic resolution, a hope that was quickly overshadowed by the escalation of military preparations by the Soviet Union. The cessation of diplomatic dialogue and the shift towards military mobilization underscored the transition from negotiation to confrontation. The Soviet Union's ramping up of military preparations signaled the imminent shift from diplomatic tension to open conflict, marking the end of the pre-war negotiations and setting the stage for the Winter War. The events leading up to this conflict illustrate the fragile nature of international negotiations, where misunderstandings, miscommunications, and miscalculations can rapidly escalate into armed conflict. The Finnish refusal to accept Soviet demands, despite the risk of war, stands as a testament to the nation's determination to defend its sovereignty against overwhelming odds. The failure of the negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union encapsulates a complex interplay of fears, mistrust, and miscommunications that precluded any viable compromise. At the heart of the impasse was a fundamental disconnect in the perceptions and intentions of both parties. Finland's primary concern was the preservation of its sovereignty and the prevention of any encroachment by the Soviet Union. The Finnish government and its people were deeply wary of Soviet intentions, especially in the context of the aggressive foreign policies pursued by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe during the same period. Conversely, the Soviet Union, particularly its leadership under Stalin, professed a concern over the strategic vulnerability of Leningrad, which was in close proximity to the Finnish border. The Soviets claimed that their demands were aimed at securing a buffer zone to protect Leningrad from potential aggression by international enemies, possibly facilitated through Finnish territory. However, the Finnish government found these assurances unconvincing, viewing the Soviet demands as a direct threat to Finland's independence and territorial integrity. The negotiations were further complicated by mutual misunderstandings of each other's positions. The Finns, perhaps optimistically, believed that the Soviet opening demands were maximalist and thus subject to negotiation down to more acceptable terms. This assumption was in stark contrast to the Soviet stance, which portrayed their demands as already minimal and non-negotiable. The incredulity expressed by the Soviet side at the Finnish refusal to acquiesce to their demands highlights the depth of the miscommunication and misunderstanding between the two parties. An additional layer of complexity was introduced by the requirements of the Finnish political system, which stipulated that any territorial concessions would need the approval of a 4/5 majority in the Finnish parliament. This legislative hurdle was a significant constraint on the Finnish negotiators' ability to make concessions, even if they had been inclined to do so. Stalin's mockery of this democratic requirement, suggesting facetiously that his and Molotov's votes be included in the parliamentary count, underscored a dismissive attitude towards the Finnish political process and further eroded the already limited trust between the negotiators. The culmination of these factors, mutual fears, mistrust, miscommunications, and the structural constraints of the Finnish political system, made a diplomatic resolution to the conflict virtually impossible. The breakdown of negotiations set the stage for the Winter War, a conflict that would test Finland's resilience and underscore the challenges of negotiating under the shadow of vastly asymmetric power dynamics. The Mainila incident on November 26, 1939, marked a critical escalation in the tensions between Finland and the Soviet Union, serving as the immediate pretext for the outbreak of the Winter War. The incident involved the shelling of a Soviet border guard post near the village of Mainila, which resulted in casualties among the Soviet guards. The Soviet Union promptly attributed the attack to Finnish forces, presenting it as an act of aggression that violated the existing non-aggression pact between the two nations. Subsequent research by Finnish and Russian historians has largely concluded that the Mainila shelling was a false flag operation, orchestrated by the NKVD, the Soviet Union's internal security organization, without the presence of Finnish artillery units in the area. This interpretation suggests that the incident was deliberately engineered by the Soviet side to serve as a casus belli, giving the Soviet Union a pretext to initiate military action against Finland and to justify withdrawing from the non-aggression pact. The revelation that Soviet war games held in March 1938 and 1939 had simulated a scenario involving border incidents at Mainila as a trigger for war further supports the theory that the shelling was a premeditated act intended to fabricate grounds for invasion. This strategic manipulation highlights the lengths to which the Soviet Union was prepared to go to achieve its objectives regarding Finland, including the use of deception and false flag operations to create the appearance of justification for military intervention. The Mainila incident exemplifies the complexities and machinations of international relations on the eve of the Winter War, illustrating how constructed events can be used to escalate conflicts and alter the course of history. The use of such tactics by the Soviet Union in this instance not only precipitated the Winter War but also cast a long shadow over the credibility of Soviet claims and actions on the international stage. The incident remains a significant point of study for historians and analysts interested in the dynamics of propaganda, false flag operations, and their impact on international conflicts. Following the Mainila incident, the Soviet Union's response, articulated by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, was swift and unequivocal. Molotov's claim that the shelling was a deliberate Finnish artillery attack set the stage for a series of demands that further escalated tensions between the two nations. The Soviet Union's demands for Finland to apologize and to reposition its troops further from the border were not just tactical moves but also strategic efforts to assert pressure and justify the impending military action against Finland. Finland's denial of responsibility for the Mainila shelling, its rejection of the Soviet demands, and the proposal for a joint investigation into the incident represented a stand of principle and a quest for a diplomatic resolution. However, the Soviet Union's characterization of Finland's response as hostile, followed by the renunciation of the non-aggression pact and the severance of diplomatic relations, effectively closed the door on peaceful negotiations. This sequence of actions underscored the depth of the strategic calculations at play, with the Soviet Union leveraging the incident to create a pretext for war. The portrayal of the Mainila shelling in Soviet historiography as a Finnish provocation persisted for decades, reflecting the broader dynamics of Cold War narratives and the manipulation of historical events for political ends. It was not until the era of glasnost in the late 1980s that the official Soviet version of the incident began to be questioned openly, signaling a shift towards greater transparency and re-evaluation of historical narratives within the Soviet Union. The continued division within Russian historiography regarding the Mainila incident, even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, illustrates the enduring complexities of interpreting historical events. The debates among historians highlight the challenges of reconciling differing national narratives and the impact of historical events on collective memory and identity. The Mainila incident and its aftermath reveal the intricate interplay between political maneuvering, military strategy, and the construction of historical narratives. This episode not only precipitated the Winter War but also serves as a case study in how incidents at the borders can escalate into broader conflicts and how their interpretation can evolve over time within the framework of changing political landscapes and historiographical debates. The remarks made by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2013, referring to the Winter War as an effort to correct mistakes related to the border established with Finland after 1917, offer an intriguing perspective on the motivations behind the Soviet actions. This statement suggests an attempt to reframe the narrative of the Winter War within the context of border security and historical territorial adjustments. However, such interpretations are complicated by the broader context of Soviet expansionist policies and the aggressive military actions undertaken against Finland. The formation of a puppet government, the Finnish Democratic Republic, by the Soviet Union on December 1, 1939, serves as a critical piece of evidence regarding the Soviet Union's intentions towards Finland. The establishment of this government, intended to administer Finland following its envisaged conquest, points towards a strategic aim that extended beyond mere territorial adjustments. The declaration associated with the formation of the Finnish Democratic Republic envisioned a reorganization and expansion of the government upon entering Helsinki, suggesting plans for a comprehensive reconfiguration of the Finnish political landscape under Soviet influence. The existence of the puppet Finnish communist government, along with the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which delineated spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, provides substantial evidence of the Soviet Union's broader objectives. These actions are indicative of an intent to fully integrate Finland into the Soviet sphere, effectively nullifying Finnish sovereignty. Opinions on the scale and ultimate goals of the Soviet invasion remain divided among historians and political analysts. While some view the invasion as a targeted effort to secure strategic territories and correct perceived border injustices, others interpret it as part of a larger plan to subsume Finland entirely under Soviet control. The Winter War, therefore, stands as a complex episode in the history of Soviet-Finnish relations, characterized by a mix of strategic, territorial, and ideological motivations. The conflict and its precursors, including the establishment of the Finnish Democratic Republic, reveal the intricate dynamics of power, national ambition, and geopolitical strategy that define the interactions between the Soviet Union and Finland in the lead-up to and during World War II. The legacy of the Winter War continues to inform discussions on national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the ethical considerations of military and political interventions. The Soviet Union's approach to the Winter War, as evidenced by the leaflets dropped over Helsinki at the outset of the conflict, encapsulated a strategy that sought to frame the invasion in ideological terms. The message to the Finnish comrades, portraying the Soviet forces not as conquerors but as liberators from capitalist and landlord oppression, reflects a broader attempt to justify the military action as part of the Soviet Union's mission to spread socialism. This narrative aimed to garner support among the Finnish population by appealing to anti-capitalist sentiments and presenting the Soviet Union as an ally in the struggle against social and economic inequalities. The formulation of a comprehensive plan for the occupation of Finland by the Soviet military leadership in 1939 indicates the extent of the preparations and the strategic importance attributed to the campaign. However, Stalin's dissatisfaction with the initial plans, deemed too conservative in pace, led to a significant recalibration of the operation's objectives. The imposition of a new deadline for Finland's capitulation, coinciding with Stalin's 60th birthday on December 21, underscores the intertwining of military objectives with political symbolism and the personal whims of the Soviet leader. The confidence in the invasion's success was further exemplified by Andrei Zhdanov's commissioning of a celebratory piece of music from Dmitry Shostakovich, the Suite on Finnish Themes. Intended to accompany the Red Army's victory parade through Helsinki, the commissioning of this piece reveals the anticipation of a swift and decisive victory over Finland. It reflects a certain level of hubris and a misjudgment of Finnish resistance, as well as the importance of cultural and symbolic acts in the Soviet war effort. The unfolding of the Winter War, however, challenged these Soviet expectations. The fierce resistance mounted by the Finnish forces, coupled with the strategic and tactical missteps of the Soviet military, resulted in a conflict that was far more prolonged and costly than anticipated. The narrative of liberation and the plans for a swift victory parade through Helsinki were confronted with the realities of warfare and the determination of the Finnish people to defend their country's sovereignty. The Winter War serves as a poignant example of the complexities of military planning, the power of national resistance, and the dangers of underestimating an opponent. The Soviet Union's initial confidence and the subsequent challenges it faced highlight the unpredictable nature of armed conflict and the role of ideological narratives in justifying and motivating military actions. The diverse perspectives offered by historians and political scientists on the Soviet Union's intentions during the Winter War reveal a multifaceted strategy that combined territorial ambitions with a desire to alter the political landscape of Finland. East von Ravach's assertion that the Soviet Central Committee aimed to restore the former borders of the Tsarist Empire, including the reintegration of Finland, underscores the historical and imperial motivations behind the Soviet actions. This ambition reflects a broader strategic objective of reasserting Soviet influence over territories that were once part of the Russian Empire, indicating a blend of historical revisionism with geopolitical strategy. Dan Reiter's analysis further illuminates the Soviet Union's goals, suggesting that the campaign against Finland was not merely about territorial adjustment but also about imposing a regime change to install a government amenable to Soviet interests. Molotov's comments about establishing a democratic republic rather than a Soviet government point to a nuanced approach aimed at creating a political environment in Finland that would be conducive to Soviet security concerns, particularly regarding the protection of Leningrad. This strategy indicates an understanding that direct Soviet control might not be necessary or feasible, as long as the new Finnish government could be relied upon to align with Soviet interests. Yuri Kilon's perspective adds another layer of analysis, focusing on the strategic significance of the Finnish defenses and the Soviet desire to secure Finland against potential use as a staging ground by hostile powers. Kilon suggests that Stalin's demands for the cession of heavily fortified Finnish territories were partly a gambit, with little expectation of Finnish acquiescence. Instead, this demand could serve as a pretext for further mobilization and as a strategy to buy time, allowing the Soviet Union to reinforce its military presence and preparedness. Collectively, these viewpoints highlight the complexity of the Soviet Union's objectives in the Winter War. The campaign was not driven by a singular motive but was rather a convergence of historical ambitions, strategic imperatives, and the desire for regime change. This multifaceted approach underscores the interplay between military, political, and historical factors in shaping Soviet policy towards Finland. The Winter War, therefore, stands as a testament to the intricate dynamics of international relations and the varied strategies employed by states to pursue their interests on the global stage. The debate over the Soviet Union's intentions towards Finland during the Winter War and the Continuation War encapsulates the complexities of interpreting historical actions and strategies. While some historians and political analysts view the Soviet actions as indicative of an ambition for full conquest, others present alternative explanations that suggest more limited objectives. William R. Trotter's assertion that the primary Soviet objective was to secure Leningrad's flank against a potential German invasion highlights a defensive rationale behind the Soviet military actions. Trotter points to the fact that the Soviet Union did not fully annex Finland during either the Winter War or the Continuation War, despite having the military capability to do so, as the strongest argument against the notion of an intention for full conquest. This perspective suggests that the Soviet Union's actions were driven by strategic security considerations rather than territorial expansionism. Similarly, Bradley Lightbody's characterization of the Soviet aim as enhancing the security of the Soviet border aligns with the view that the primary motivation was defensive. By securing additional territory and establishing a more favorable border, the Soviet Union aimed to reduce its vulnerability to external threats, particularly from the direction of Finland. A. Chubarian's reference to the absence of documents in Russian archives explicitly outlining a plan to annex Finland further supports the argument against the idea of a complete Soviet conquest. Chubarian posits that the Soviet goal was to gain territory and reinforce influence in the region, which is consistent with a strategy aimed at strengthening the Soviet Union's strategic position rather than outright annexation. These alternative viewpoints contribute to a nuanced understanding of the Soviet Union's objectives in its conflicts with Finland. They underscore the importance of considering strategic, security, and defensive considerations in the analysis of military and political actions. The complexities of the Soviet-Finnish engagements during this period reflect the intricate interplay of historical circumstances, geopolitical strategies, and the dynamic nature of international relations. Stephen Kotkin's analysis further illuminates the complexities of Soviet intentions toward Finland in contrast to its actions in the Baltic states. By highlighting the differences in Soviet approaches, total Sovietization in the Baltics through pacts of mutual assistance versus seeking limited territorial concessions from Finland, Kotkin argues against the notion of a full-scale annexation plan for Finland. The fact that the Soviet Union was willing to offer land in return for the territories it demanded from Finland underscores a strategic approach that diverged significantly from the outright absorption tactics used in the Baltic region. This distinction suggests that the Soviet objectives in Finland were more nuanced, focusing on securing strategic advantages and buffer zones rather than direct annexation. Kotkin's point about Stalin's personal involvement in the negotiations with Finland further supports the argument that the Soviet Union was genuinely interested in reaching an agreement. Stalin's attendance at the majority of the meetings and his willingness to adjust the Soviet demands indicate a level of engagement and flexibility that contrasts with a rigid intention to conquer or Sovietize Finland fully. This personal investment in the negotiation process by Stalin suggests that the Soviet Union valued a diplomatic solution that would secure its strategic interests without resorting to full annexation. However, the negotiations were ultimately unsuccessful, with mutual mistrust and misunderstandings playing pivotal roles in the failure to reach an accord. The deep-seated suspicions on both sides, influenced by historical antagonisms and the broader geopolitical context of the time, contributed to an atmosphere where concessions were viewed with skepticism, and intentions were frequently misinterpreted. Kotkin's analysis sheds light on the multifaceted nature of Soviet foreign policy objectives and the intricate diplomacy involved in the Soviet-Finnish interactions. It emphasizes the importance of understanding the specific historical and geopolitical contexts in evaluating the motivations and actions of states. The case of Finland during this period illustrates how strategic considerations, diplomatic engagement, and the challenges of trust and communication intertwine in the complex dance of international relations. Prior to the Winter War, the Soviet leadership harbored expectations of a swift and decisive victory over Finland, an assumption largely informed by recent military successes and the apparent disparity in strength between the Soviet and Finnish forces. The successful invasion of eastern Poland by the Red Army, achieved with relatively minimal casualties, bolstered Stalin's belief in the feasibility of a quick triumph over Finland. This confidence was echoed by influential figures such as Andrei Zhdanov and military strategist Kliment Voroshilov, who were optimistic about the prospects of a rapid Soviet victory. However, within the Soviet military hierarchy, there was a spectrum of opinions regarding the best approach to the Finnish campaign. Red Army Chief of Staff Boris Shaposnikov advocated for a more cautious strategy, emphasizing a focused assault on the Karelian Isthmus. Shaposnikov's call for a narrower front was accompanied by recommendations for a comprehensive buildup of forces, substantial fire support, and logistical preparations. He stressed the importance of deploying the army's most elite units and ensuring a rational order of battle to mitigate the challenging terrain of Finland, characterized by its dense forests, lakes, rivers, and swamps. Kirill Meretskov, the military commander aligned with Zhdanov, acknowledged the operational challenges posed by the Finnish landscape, noting the difficulties in utilizing Soviet forces effectively in such an environment. Despite these acknowledged challenges and the more reserved stance of some generals, the public messaging from the Soviet military leadership, including Meretskov's own statements, projected an expectation of a quick resolution to the campaign, suggesting it would take no more than 2 weeks. This disconnect between the recognition of the challenges inherent in the Finnish terrain and the outwardly confident projection of a swift campaign reveals a complex interplay of optimism, strategic calculation, and political pressures within the Soviet military command. The caution advised by Shaposnikov and the realistic assessments of operational difficulties by Meretskov were overshadowed by the broader narrative of assured victory, setting the stage for a conflict that would defy Soviet expectations and test the Red Army's capabilities in ways that had not been fully anticipated. The Winter War ultimately served as a stark lesson in the limits of military power and the dangers of underestimating an opponent, underscoring the importance of strategic prudence, thorough planning, and adaptability in the face of unforeseen challenges. The profound impact of Stalin's purges on the Red Army during the 1930s significantly undermined its operational effectiveness and command structure. The purges resulted in the loss of a substantial portion of the Army's experienced officer corps, including 3 of its 5 marshals, the majority of division or higher-level commanders, and tens of thousands of officers of all ranks. This decimation of experienced leadership created a vacuum that was often filled by individuals whose loyalty to Stalin and the Soviet regime was prioritized over military competence. The introduction of political commissars into the military hierarchy further complicated the decision-making process, as these commissars had the authority to override military decisions based on political considerations, thereby eroding the autonomy and authority of unit commanders. The dual command system, with its emphasis on political loyalty and oversight, contributed to inefficiencies and a dilution of military expertise within the Red Army. This restructuring had far-reaching implications for the Red Army's performance in subsequent conflicts, including the Winter War against Finland. The divide within the Soviet High Command, exemplified by the factions led by veterans of the Spanish Civil War and those who had seen action at Khalkhin Gol, reflected broader tensions and disagreements over military strategy and doctrine. The lessons learned from the battles of Khalkhin Gol, which had been a significant demonstration of combined arms tactics involving tanks, artillery, and aircraft, were largely ignored due to the fractured command structure and the prevailing political climate within the Soviet military establishment. The underperformance of the Russian BT tanks during the Winter War, along with the protracted and costly nature of the Soviet campaign in Finland, underscored the strategic and operational deficiencies that had taken root within the Red Army as a consequence of the purges and the subsequent reorganization. The contrast between the rapid success achieved by General Georgy Zhukov at Khalkhin Gol and the difficulties encountered during the Winter War highlights the impact of leadership and organizational factors on military effectiveness. The Winter War thus served as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities within the Red Army, prompting a re-evaluation of Soviet military strategies and an acknowledgement of the need to address the weaknesses exposed by the conflict. The experience of the Winter War would have significant implications for the Red Army's development and its preparations for the larger conflict that lay ahead in World War II. The Winter War presented the Soviet military with a unique set of challenges that diverged significantly from the conditions under which German blitzkrieg tactics had been successfully employed in Central Europe. The Finnish terrain, characterized by its vast trackless forests, swamps, and the absence of a dense network of paved roads, posed significant obstacles to the kind of rapid, mechanized warfare that blitzkrieg relied upon. The Finnish army's logistical and command centers, deeply embedded within the country and shielded by the natural landscape, were far removed from the vulnerabilities typical of more centralized and accessible targets in Central Europe. The observation by war correspondent John Langdon Davis about the Finnish landscape underscores the inherent difficulties of conducting a conventional blitzkrieg campaign in such an environment. The terrain effectively negated the advantages of speed, surprise, and mechanized mobility that were hallmarks of blitzkrieg, transforming the Finnish landscape into a formidable barrier against invasion. The Soviet military's initial underestimation of these challenges, as well as its failure to achieve the necessary level of tactical coordination and local initiative, contributed to the difficulties encountered during the Winter War. The Red Army struggles to adapt its tactics to the Finnish terrain and conditions underscore the limitations of applying blitzkrieg principles in all contexts. The shifts in command structure during the conflict, with Kirill Meretskov being replaced by the General Staff Supreme Command under the leadership of Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin, Nikolai Kuznetsov, and Boris Shapusnikov, reflect the Soviet High Command's recognition of the need for strategic adjustments. The eventual appointment of Semyon Timoshenko, who advocated for a return to Shapusnikov's initial plan of a concentrated assault on the Karelian Isthmus, marked a significant pivot in Soviet strategy. This shift towards a more focused approach aimed at breaching the Mannerheim Line represented an adaptation to the realities of the Finnish defense and the challenges posed by the terrain. The reformation of the Leningrad military district into the Northwestern Front in January 1940 further indicates the Soviet military's efforts to reorganize and refine its operational focus in response to the difficulties encountered during the initial stages of the Winter War. These strategic and organizational adjustments highlight the learning curve faced by the Red Army and the complexities of conducting military operations in challenging environments against a determined and resourceful opponent. The organization of the Soviet forces during the Winter War was designed to implement a comprehensive strategy aimed at swiftly overcoming Finnish defenses and achieving decisive territorial gains. The deployment and objectives of the various Soviet armies reflect a multi-pronged approach to the campaign, with each force assigned specific roles and targets across the Finnish landscape. The 7th Army, positioned on the Karelian Isthmus, was a formidable force tasked with a critical early objective of the war: to breach the Finnish defenses on the isthmus and capture the strategic city of Viipuri. The composition of the 7th Army, including 9 divisions, a tank corps, and 3 tank brigades, underscores the significance of this mission in the Soviet operational plan. The subsequent advance towards Lappeenranta and the westward turn towards Lahti were intended to set the stage for a final assault on the Finnish capital, Helsinki. The division of this force into the 7th and 13th Armies later in the campaign indicates a tactical adjustment to the realities on the ground and the challenges encountered in executing the original plan. The 8th Army, operating north of Lake Ladoga, was tasked with a flanking maneuver aimed at striking the rear of the Mannerheim Line. Comprising 6 divisions and a tank brigade, the 8th Army's mission was critical for circumventing the formidable Finnish defenses and creating vulnerabilities in the Finnish strategic positioning. The 9th Army's role was to penetrate central Finland through the Kainuu region, with the strategic goal of cutting Finland in half. The composition of the 9th Army, including 3 divisions with an additional division en route, highlights the importance of this thrust in the Soviet strategy to divide and conquer, potentially isolating different segments of the Finnish military and disrupting logistical and command structures. The 14th Army, based in Murmansk, had the northernmost objectives of capturing the Arctic port of Petsamo and advancing towards Rovaniemi. With 3 divisions at its disposal, the 14th Army's mission was to secure the northern flank and extend Soviet control to strategic locations in the Arctic, further pressuring Finnish defenses from multiple directions. The strategic deployment of these Soviet forces illustrates the ambitious scope of the Soviet military objectives during the Winter War. The diverse missions assigned to each army were part of a broader plan to encircle, penetrate, and ultimately subdue Finnish resistance across multiple fronts. However, the fierce and determined Finnish defense, challenging terrain, and logistical complications would test the Soviet military's capabilities and adaptability in the face of unexpected resistance. The Finnish military strategy during the Winter War was significantly influenced by the country's geographical realities and the immense challenges posed by a long, mostly impassable border with the Soviet Union. The vast border length of 1,340 kilometers, 830 miles, and the limited number of access points through it necessitated a defensive posture that leveraged Finland's natural terrain and the resilience of its forces. Finland's pre-war military estimates had significantly underestimated the scale of the Soviet threat, anticipating a far smaller number of Soviet divisions than were actually deployed. This miscalculation of Soviet strength, particularly north of Lake Ladoga, underscored the daunting challenge faced by the Finnish Defense Command. Despite these strategic and logistical challenges, Finland possessed several key advantages. Reservist force. Finland's army was bolstered by a large reserve force, regularly trained and with some having combat experience from the Finnish Civil War. This experience, combined with universal training in basic survival skills like skiing, enhanced the mobility and resilience of Finnish forces in the challenging winter conditions. Adaptation to the environment. The lack of proper military uniforms was mitigated by the use of warm civilian clothing, which, while not ideal, helped protect Finnish soldiers from the harsh winter weather. The Finns' ability to adapt to and exploit their environmental conditions was a critical aspect of their defensive strategy. Economic and material challenges. The drafting of a significant portion of Finland's working-age men presented considerable economic difficulties, impacting the country's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. The shortage of materiel, including anti-tank weapons, aircraft, and ammunition, further compounded the Finnish army's challenges. The dire ammunition situation, with stockpiles expected to last only between 19 to 60 days, restricted Finnish artillery capabilities and made conservation of ammunition a critical concern. Arms compatibility. The use of Mosin-Nagant rifles, which shared ammunition compatibility with the Soviet forces' rifles, provided a small but significant logistical advantage, allowing Finnish forces to use captured Soviet ammunition. The Finnish army's strategic disposition, characterized by a reliance on reservist manpower, adaptation to severe environmental and logistical constraints, and innovative tactics, underscored the resourcefulness and determination of the Finnish defense. Despite the overwhelming odds, these factors contributed to Finland's ability to mount a formidable resistance against the Soviet invasion, highlighting the complexity of military engagements where numerical and material superiority does not always guarantee success. The Finnish military disposition during the Winter War was a strategic alignment that aimed to maximize the country's defensive capabilities against the Soviet invasion. The organization of the Finnish forces into distinct units and corps, each with specific geographical responsibilities, reflects a comprehensive approach to defending the extensive and challenging terrain of Finland. The Army of the Isthmus, commanded by Hugo Osterman, the Army of the Isthmus was the primary Finnish force tasked with defending the Karelian Isthmus, a critical area given its proximity to the Finnish capital, Helsinki, and its strategic significance as a potential Soviet invasion route. Comprising 6 divisions, this army was the cornerstone of Finland's defensive efforts on the isthmus. The positioning of the 2nd Army Corps on the right flank and the 3rd Army Corps on the left flank of the Army of the Isthmus was a tactical arrangement designed to provide depth and flexibility in response to Soviet movements. The 4th Army Corps, located north of Lake Ladoga, the 4th Army Corps, initially under the command of Juho Heiskanen and later Valdemar Hägglund, consisted of 2 divisions. This corps was responsible for defending the areas north of the strategic lake, a region characterized by challenging terrain that offered both advantages and obstacles for defensive operations. The 4th Army Corps played a crucial role in countering Soviet efforts to flank the Mannerheim Line and penetrate deeper into Finnish territory. The North Finland Group, under the leadership of Viljo Tuompo, the North Finland Group was a composite force that included White Guards, Border Guards, and drafted reservist units. This grouping was tasked with securing the northernmost regions of Finland, areas that, while not the primary focus of Soviet military efforts, were crucial for maintaining the integrity of the Finnish defense across the entire length of the border with the Soviet Union. The Finnish military strategy, characterized by the strategic positioning of these corps and groups, leveraged Finland's geographic advantages and the resilience of its forces. Despite facing a significantly larger and better equipped adversary, the Finnish military's organizational structure and deployment were geared towards exploiting the difficult terrain, maximizing the effectiveness of their limited resources, and engaging in a defensive campaign aimed at preserving Finland's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The composition and disposition of the Finnish forces during the Winter War underscore the challenges of defending against a numerically superior invader in difficult terrain and with limited resources. The Finnish strategy of organized, flexible defense in depth, combined with the utilization of local knowledge and terrain, played a critical role in the effectiveness of their military efforts. The Soviet invasion of Finland on November 30, 1939, marked the beginning of the Winter War, a conflict that would dramatically showcase the resilience of the Finnish people and the strategic challenges of warfare in the harsh northern landscape. The invasion, initiated with a massive force of 21 divisions totaling around 450,000 men, and the concurrent bombing of Helsinki, which resulted in significant civilian casualties and destruction, immediately drew international condemnation. In an attempt to counteract the negative global reaction, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov made the infamous claim that the Soviet Air Force was dropping humanitarian aid, not bombs, on the Finnish population. This assertion led to the sarcastic designation of the aerial bombs as Molotov bread baskets by the Finns, highlighting the absurdity of the situation and the stark contrast between the Soviet narrative and the realities on the ground. The unprovoked aggression by the Soviet Union violated multiple international agreements, including the Treaty of Tartu, bilateral non-aggression pacts with Finland, and the Covenant of the League of Nations. These breaches of international law underscored the flagrant disregard of the Soviet Union for established diplomatic norms and commitments. In response to the invasion, Field Marshal C.G.E. Mannerheim was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Defence Forces, symbolizing a rallying point for Finnish resistance. The political landscape in Finland also underwent significant changes, with Risto Raity's cabinet, including Väinö Tanner as foreign minister, taking over in a move that reflected the urgent need for unified national leadership in the face of the Soviet threat. The Finnish government's decision to bring the issue before the League of Nations led to the expulsion of the Soviet Union from the League and a call for member states to support Finland. This international response, while highlighting the global opposition to the Soviet invasion, also reflected the limitations of international organizations in effectively deterring acts of aggression. The establishment of the Finnish Democratic Republic, a puppet government headed by Otto Kuusinen and operating in the parts of Finnish Karelia occupied by the Soviets, represented an attempt by the Soviet Union to legitimize its control over Finnish territory. However, this government, often referred to as the Terijoki government, found little support among the Finnish population, which overwhelmingly backed the legitimate government in Helsinki. The unity and determination exhibited by the Finnish people in the face of the Soviet invasion, later termed the spirit of the Winter War, became a defining element of Finland's national identity and a testament to the country's resolve to defend its sovereignty and democratic institutions against overwhelming odds. The initial stages of the Winter War saw the Finnish forces employing strategic defensive tactics against a numerically superior Soviet invasion. The Mannerheim Line, a series of defensive fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus, became the focal point of Finnish resistance. Despite the daunting odds, with 250,000 Soviet soldiers facing 130,000 Finns across the isthmus, the Finnish command's deployment of a defense-in-depth strategy, involving around 21,000 men positioned ahead of the Mannerheim Line, was aimed at delaying and inflicting damage on the advancing Red Army. The Finnish forces encountered significant challenges, particularly due to the Soviet use of tanks, against which they had limited anti-tank weapons and training. However, the Finns' ingenuity in devising countermeasures, such as the use of Molotov cocktails to immobilize tanks at close range, demonstrated their ability to adapt and exploit the vulnerabilities of Soviet armored tactics. By December 6, Finnish covering forces had strategically withdrawn to the Mannerheim Line, setting the stage for the Battle of Taipale. This engagement showcased the effectiveness of Finnish preparations and the advantages provided by the terrain. The Finnish artillery's pre-scouted fire plans and the defensive benefits of elevation and dry ground contributed to the repulsion of Soviet infantry attacks with heavy casualties. Despite repeated Soviet assaults, bolstered by additional divisions and tanks, the attacks were consistently pushed back, resulting in significant Soviet losses. North of Lake Ladoga, in Ladoga Karelia, the Finnish defenders leveraged the forest wilderness to their advantage, compensating for their lack of modern road networks with knowledge of the terrain. The Finnish victory at Talviharvi, led by Paavo Talvila, marked the first major Finnish success of the war, defeating advancing Soviet forces despite the disparity in numbers. This victory not only demonstrated the Finnish forces' tactical proficiency but also bolstered morale among the defenders. The early phase of the Winter War highlighted the critical role of strategic defense, terrain advantage, and innovative tactics in confronting a stronger adversary. The Finnish response to the Soviet invasion, characterized by resilience, adaptability, and effective use of limited resources, set a precedent for the fierce resistance that would define the remainder of the conflict. In the more remote regions of central and northern Finland, the Soviet Union embarked on a significant military campaign despite the challenging terrain and the sparse road network. Contrary to Finnish expectations, which anticipated limited Soviet operations in these areas, the Red Army deployed 8 divisions, reinforcing them heavily with armor and artillery. This move demonstrated the Soviet intention to not only engage Finland along the Mannerheim Line but to also open multiple fronts across the country, stretching Finnish defensive capabilities. Lieksa and Kumo, the attacks at Lieksa, led by the 155th Rifle Division, and at Kumo, by the 44th, marked the beginning of Soviet efforts to penetrate deep into central Finland. These operations aimed to exploit the challenging terrain to their advantage, expecting it to hinder Finnish movements and responses. Suomussalmi and the Rae Road, one of the most ambitious Soviet maneuvers, was undertaken by the 163rd Rifle Division at Suomussalmi, with the objective to cut Finland in half by advancing along the Rae Road. This operation, if successful, would have divided Finnish forces, disrupting supply lines and communication, and potentially demoralizing Finnish troops by demonstrating the reach of Soviet power. Salla in Finnish Lapland, the northernmost front, saw the Soviet 88th and 122nd Rifle Divisions launching an attack at Salla. The operation in Lapland aimed to secure the northern flank and potentially provide a pathway to the Swedish border, threatening Finland's connections to potential external support. Petsamo, the Arctic port of Petsamo, faced an amphibious and land assault by the 104th Mountain Rifle Division, supported by naval gunfire. The strategic goal here was to cut off Finland from the Arctic Ocean, depriving it of a vital maritime supply route and asserting Soviet control over the northernmost part of the country. The scale and scope of these Soviet operations in central and northern Finland reflect a comprehensive strategy aimed at overwhelming Finnish defenses through simultaneous assaults across multiple fronts. However, the hostile terrain, characterized by dense forests, swamps, and a lack of infrastructure, posed significant logistical challenges to the Soviet forces. The Finnish defenders, more accustomed to and prepared for operations in such conditions, utilized the terrain to their advantage, employing guerrilla tactics, and making the most of their intimate knowledge of the landscape to resist the Soviet advance effectively. These engagements in the less densely populated areas of Finland not only tested the resolve and resourcefulness of the Finnish forces but also underscored the complexities of conducting large-scale military operations in challenging environments. The Soviet attempts to secure swift victories across these fronts encountered stiff resistance, highlighting the difficulties of translating numerical and technological superiority into operational success in adverse conditions. Thank you all for watching this first episode of our Winter War series, exploring the intense battles and strategic maneuvers that define this pivotal moment in history. We've delved into the challenges faced by both Finnish and Soviet forces in the harsh northern landscape, highlighting the resilience, resourcefulness, and determination of those who fought on both sides. But our journey doesn't end here. Be sure to join us for episode 2, where we'll continue our exploration of the Winter War, diving deeper into the remaining battles, decisive moments, and the ultimate outcome of this conflict. Don't miss out on the next chapter of this compelling saga. The Animated General. Out.